Ready? Good morning, everybody. So I think all of you now have a copy of this report and pretty much know what we recommended. So I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes talking about how we arrived at this, what our main principles were in guiding us toward these recommendations, and then perfectly happy to answer all of your questions. So first and foremost, we took the position, and I have to say, I just want to thank all of my fellow TMRB board members for their hard work on this, and particularly Juliette Michelson, who was in effect, our staff director and helped guide us. But the guiding principle for us was, how do we satisfy, in the first instance, the many, not the few? And for that, we really recognize that the many are the million-plus people who take mass transit into the CBD every day, and the relatively few, and at least in one category, are the 150,000 or so people who drive. But even within that 150,000 people who drive, how do we mostly satisfy in as fair a way as possible their interests while meeting the goals of the statute, achieving the goals of congestion pricing, which is to reduce congestion in the region, reduce pollution in the region, and generate funds for the MTA's capital program. The second principle that we really adopted was one of equity, and that equity in its very broadest sense, social equity to be sure, and we took a number of steps, and you'll see in a number of our recommendations that expands some of the benefits for low-income drivers and the like, for low-income workers and the like, but also a sense of fairness for everybody. We really wanted to make sure that as our recommendations came out, in general, the public would think that they were fair. We know that this is a controversial issue, but we really did try to strike a balance of fairness. So within that, we did several things that I think all of you are familiar with. One, we really made an effort to keep the base toll as low as we possibly could, and the base toll, as you know, that we recommend is $15. And the way we kept that base toll as low as we possibly could was first by limiting exemptions. We have very few, hardly any exemptions. We had, as many of you know, requests for well over 120 exemptions, each one supported by thousands of people. But again, using the principle of how do we serve the many, not the few, and how do we be as fair as possible, we really wanted to limit exemptions, and we did. And that helped keep the fare low. We also recognized that crossing credits for those using the tunnels that enter the CBD, the greater the crossing credits, the higher the base toll. And again, even though those drivers who use those tunnels represent a minority of drivers who come into the CBD, we wanted to give some crossing credit because we wanted to help a little bit in reducing toll shopping. But if we had created a much higher crossing credit, again, it would have ended up with a much higher base toll, and that we didn't want to see. We expanded greatly the discount in nighttime hours in two ways. First, the environmental assessment required a minimum of a 50% discount between midnight and 4 a.m. We expanded that to a 75% discount and expanded the hours from 9 p.m. to 5 a.m. on weekdays and 9 p.m. to 9 a.m. On weekends. We also had to be very careful with respect to environmental justice communities. We did not want to see an increase in diversions and trucks, particularly from the central business district to areas that are sensitive to higher truck traffic, particularly low-income neighborhoods, and that was a balance for us. We do want to see truck traffic coming into the CBD go down, but at the same time, we don't want to see it go down at the expense of low-income communities. And the way we achieved that was by having a somewhat smaller differential on tolls on trucks than the differential that exists on regular tolls that the MTA or Port Authority charge compared to automobiles, but also, again, by having a big discount on during evenings from 9 p.m. to 5 a.m., encouraging trucks particularly to use those hours to come into the central business district. That's good for congestion, reduces congestion if we can push trucks to later hours, but also helps minimize and in our view, eliminate diversions to sensitive neighborhoods. We decided to impose the toll, or recommend to impose the toll on entry only. The statute that guides us said that we could apply a toll for entry or remaining in the CBD. We thought that it was much better to simply apply it to entry. It's easier to understand. That's what causes congestion when a vehicle enters the CBD. And so the toll will only apply to entry, not to exit or not to remaining. And then finally, the very difficult and I know contentious issue with respect to taxis and FHVs. The environmental assessment limited a charge on taxis or FHVs to essentially the same as for autos, but once a day. However, that imposing that on drivers who own their own taxis or FHVs, drivers who work for different companies, we felt was not only unfair but impractical. And we strongly recommend the lowest toll that we felt we could do for taxis, which is $1.25, and twice that for FHVs. Again, with a view toward fairness, a view toward being sensitive to environmental justice communities, and with a view toward the ultimate goal of reducing congestion in the CBD, because taxis and FHVs, after all, represent the majority of vehicles in the CBD at any given time. And that's basically the principles that we use to come up with the recommendations we have. And with that, I'll answer questions.
Why don't we start with Marcia Kramer over there, CBS 2. Marcia.
So I have actually a double-barrel question. Number one, obviously this is a proposal, and it could be tweaked. So the question I have for you, the first question is, what's the possibility that there could be changes, as already public officials have questioned, like the mayor has questioned the failure to give an exemption for medical, people going for medical things, and I'm sure there are going to be other exemptions as the day goes on. So I'm wondering, number one, what could be tweaked, and number two, John Samuelson has submitted his resignation, saying that he's not spending enough on extra service for mass transit, and so therefore he's resigned. So if you could comment on both things, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. We did spend a lot of time on potential exemptions, and the reason we decided not to exempt medical appointments was with several reasons, actually. One was that, for the most part, particularly for people covered by Medicaid, Medicare, health insurance, their transportation costs are covered if they go to a medical facility and travel to a medical facility. And that's for wealthier people, that is a deduction, and we decided that that would be inappropriate and very difficult if we provided it to actually enforce and monitor in any significant way. As for John Samuelson's resignation, I was frankly very disappointed to see it. John made many contributions to our work, and as you know, I think all of you have seen his letter of resignation. He, frankly, almost entirely, as best I can tell, agrees and says in his letter, agrees with our recommendations. The issues that he raised, largely beyond the scope of the TMRB, although I will point out that the goal of congestion pricing, or one of its most important goals, is to generate the revenue for a capital program for the MTA that will help the vast majority of people who use public transit and will expand public transit or expand access to public transit for people who can't access it today. So while that's beyond immediately the scope of our work, I think that the goal of our work, for sure, is to expand mass transit for everybody, and that will, I believe, get to the issues that John raises, which are beyond our scope.
The other things that people that didn't get exempted were basically people who work for, public officials, police, fire, teachers, people like that who had demanded exemptions because they're going to work for the government in some fashion in the central business district. Was that a calculated decision that everybody should pay?
Yes, it was a calculated decision. Again, we thought mostly in terms of the many, not the few. There's no reason why public employees, any more than private employees, should be exempt from paying for using their private vehicles to come into the central business district if they're crucial if their use of an automobile is crucial to their work, and their employer, public or private, believes that their employees' use of an automobile is important, the employer should bear that cost or reimburse the employee. But again, when it comes to exemptions, I think we should start from the fact that there are very, very few exemptions to regular tolling today on tunnels and bridges and the like. So really, we were very, very, very reluctant to provide exemptions. And again, applying the principle of for the many rather than the few, recognizing that for every exemption that's granted, it not only forces up the base toll on everybody else, but also the more exemptions that are granted, the more other people will say, you granted an exemption for them, you didn't grant an exemption for me. It does create a sense of unfairness as to why certain categories should be exempt and other categories shouldn't be. So we were indeed very parsimonious about exemptions.
All right, we're going to be limiting follow-ups just because of limited time. We'll go to Newton Jones Burkett, the third, right back there from ABC 7. Newton.
Hello. Great. Thanks, Tim. Clearly, you and the board agonized over this. What was the biggest challenge that you faced as a board in making the recommendations. And then also, a second part to that is, people will look at this and say, wow, this is what it's going to be. How likely is it, and sharpen the pencil on this, please, that this is what it's going to be? And then the other question, obviously, about the biggest challenge that you guys faced.
Well, I think everyone, all of us recognize that this is a contentious issue, and maybe somewhat surprisingly, I would say every single person on the TMRB made a contribution that ended up in the report. There were very few, if any, outright disagreements on we should do X instead of Y. So there was, I would say, with respect to the work of the that was of the TMRB itself and the charge to us, there was very, very little acrimony, especially given what we all know is a very difficult and contentious issue generally, although everyone went into this recognizing that congestion pricing was and is a very important step forward for the region, for the city of New York, for the MTA's capital program, and I think that's really what guided us. This is absent this, we're going to be choking in our own traffic for a long time to come, and the MTA is not going to have the funds necessary to provide quality service. And I think you have to remember that congestion pricing is a program that has been supported by the last 3 mayors, the last 2 governors, and a very, very broad coalition of ranging from the business community to social equity advocates. So we came in with a common goal, and that was very, very helpful. I think we made recommendations with the belief that all of these are implementable. We wanted to make sure that they could be accomplished, and but they're recommendations. So now they're up to the TBTA MTA board.
All right, we go to Melissa Colorado right over here from NBC4. Melissa.
Good morning. Hi. So I notice here on page 19, you have on weekdays the number of vehicles, the speeds are somewhat higher, or they slow down to 7 miles per hour on both weekdays and weekends. Do you have any projections on how the improvements in terms of the speeds, will they increase? Are there any neighborhoods where you really predict the projections will be much better for drivers and pedestrians alike?
I think in general, and I'll ask Juliet if she has more fine-grained information on this, but in general, we expect congestion in the CBD to decline by 17%, at least in terms of the number of vehicles that enter the CBD. There are other ways of measuring congestion and speed, but just by the basic reduction in the number of vehicles entering the CBD, that will be, I think that will lead to certainly faster speeds for everyone. And I should also add, and I think we note in our report, that congestion will also decline in the region as a whole. Pollution will decline in the region as a whole. The focus is on the CBD because that's the center of our regional economy. But the benefits of congestion pricing go way beyond the CBD itself.
So just to clarify, just 17% drop in cars?
17% drop in the number of vehicles. The toll proposal predicts that there will be a 17% drop in the number of vehicles entering the CBD.
All right, that was Juliet Michelson for those watching the stream. We go to Dave Colon
Sorry,
right
one
here
more thing.
from
Sorry.
Streets Blog.
Out of 900,000, so if we'll do the math, we should check the math, but 17% of 900,000 is a lot of cars. I can't calculate it that quickly.
150,000.
Thank you.
Roughly, I don't know.
Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, hey guys. There were two things that I was curious about here. One is that in the report it does talk about traffic patterns and the EJ communities, which were modeled very explicitly in the EA, but there don't seem to be any numbers about it here. So I'm curious if there's going to be any numbers that come out showing what the traffic impacts will be in terms of, outside of the CBD. In terms of your toll shopping and everything else, people getting around the toll, and then if you have any explicit numbers that are going to come out about the transit ridership impacts that the toll is going to have, since this doesn't really conform to any of the exact scenarios that were modeled in the EA.
I think the modeling that we did was to assure that our recommendations complied with the environmental assessment and that we weren't triggering any additional significant impacts anywhere, and we're very satisfied that it doesn't. Beyond that, I think time will tell, but Juliet may have.
Yeah, let me just add to that a little bit. For those of you who are not familiar with traffic modeling, which I was not until recently, this is actually a very time-intensive process. We have conducted, for the purposes of this analysis, sort of a first phase of traffic modeling. The analysis that you saw in the EA was the product of literally months of running different computers for weeks on end. So we do not quite yet have the level of detail that was included in the EA, but we certainly will do that before the TBTA board adopts the final toll structure.
All right, let's move on to Samantha Liebman over there from New York 1. Sam.
With people covering their license plates being a problem, how will enforcement, will it be ramped up because of this program? I know that there's an effort in the bridges and tunnels, but how are you going to do that with the CBD?
That's an operational issue. Is beyond me and beyond the TMRB. I don't know if there's.
I would just say enforcement is important.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's recognized by all that enforcement is very important here, and as you all know, the sensors for this are being installed now, and I hope that they will work well, and I'm sure that they will. But for a whole host of reasons, covering up license plates, as is taking place, is not a good thing for anybody, except those who are doing it, and hopefully they'll all get caught.
All right next door, Juliet Papa there from 1010 Wins, 92.3, CBS 880, and Odyssey.com.
Just a few, thank you. So how does this work when the cap is going to be lifted on cabs and for-hire vehicles and the electric cars? So now you're going to have more cars within the districts. How does that work when environmentally all these cars, you're going to have more cars idling? And how does this work when quality of life for people who live in the affected area are now going to have trucks coming in the middle of the night to make all their deliveries and keep people awake at night?
You know, this is a central business district, and it is going to be better for everybody, certainly, to have trucks making deliveries at night rather than during the day, to the extent that that's possible. For a lot of businesses, that's not possible. But, you know, the city of New York, for as far back as I can remember, has desired and had as a matter of policy shifting truck traffic into later hours. I will also say that I spent a good chunk of my life working with the business and residential community in Lower Manhattan, and helped oversee that community's change from a purely business district into a mixed use district with residents and businesses. And that was an early concern among residents and businesses, but it seems to have worked out pretty well. And in fact, as you all know, Lower Manhattan is now a fairly thriving mixed-use community. So I do think that this is something that will work fine, and certainly on balance will have a major impact on congestion during the day. Trucks are a big issue during the day. They're a very small percentage of vehicles, but they have a large impact.
But what about cabs, the increase in cabs? There are a lot of cabs now on the
I think
street.
the market ultimately takes care of that. And again, as is projected here, we're going to see overall a 17% reduction, we believe, in the number of vehicles entering the CBD. That's more than 150,000 vehicles. Right now, a majority are FHVs and taxis. Probably in the future, a majority will be FHVs and taxis, but not necessarily more FHVs and taxis.
All right, let's come
And
over to
let
this
me-
side.
I just
Oh,
want
sorry,
to
go
add
ahead,
something.
Julie.
An important component of this program is beyond the TMRB, now I'm speaking about TBTA, MTA moving forward, is a very elaborate monitoring program. The legislation requires the EA is committed, the MTA, to studying the impacts of this tolling program on congestion, on air quality, on transit use, on any number of performance metrics. And, you know, we will be able to adjust the toll structure based on how it is performing.
Yeah. And I just want to add to that. That's a very important point. Our recommendations are, which we hope the TBTA will embrace and adopt. We gave a lot of thought to them. They're beginning. They're not immutable. Over time, we'll all learn, and we'll get better at it. That's what's happened in cities around the world that have applied congestion pricing, and those cities that have applied congestion pricing are all pretty happy with it. And they've modified as they've gone along as well, and I'm sure we will too.
Now from America's oldest continuously published newspaper, we've got Nolan Hicks in the house. Nolan.
Thanks, Tim. Carl, if I could just circle back a little bit on Marcia's question about the medical exemptions. The mayor said this morning that that was one thing he was looking for, and he described your report as the beginning of the conversation and not as something to be taken as sort of fait accompli. So how much flex do you think there is? And when you think about sort of that corridor on the Lower East Side where there are all the hospitals, it is a schlep from the 6 train to walk over to Langone. And you know, if you're going to Langone, you probably have insurance and you probably have some money, but Bellevue's over there too, the VA's over there. Can you sort of explain how there are services that need to be accessed by folks who are working class or poor New Yorkers who may be coming from parts of the city or from other parts of the region where there isn't a lot of transit access, and now they will have to pay the toll?
Well, as I said, one of the things that we considered, and this was an issue that we did spend some time on and referenced in our report, because we didn't reference all of the 120 plus exemptions. We did reference those that we really gave a lot of thought to, and this was one of them. Again, for the populations that you're talking about, Nolan, I think most have coverage that does pay for transportation, particularly Medicaid, VA, and the like. And so we think that it is going to be fair. But again, we will see over time. I think that this, as you say, a lot of people who use those hospitals do have the funds to pay for a congestion charge, and those that don't, generally speaking, have the kind of public coverage that would cover this cost, including Access-a-Ride, by the way.
I could just sort of ask one more question. Can we talk for a minute about the politics of it? Every fare hike is, protested pretty heavily. Every time you implement a new toll or raise a toll, there are a lot of protests. Trying to get more funding through the MTA was a giant fight when they hiked the payroll tax in the city. How do you sell this? How do you sell this politically in an environment where, there has been a tremendous amount of backlash against, the governor and other folks from backing more funds from the MTA previously?
Well, as I said at the outset, to me, I can only say that what we tried to do was recognize the public benefits from this program, and they are significant. And they're things that people care about: congestion, pollution, a high-quality public transit system, an expanded public transit system. These are, as you said, getting additional funds to the MTA has not been easy. This is 1/3, literally, of the current capital program for the MTA. It deals with resiliency. It deals with sustainability. It deals with reliability. It deals with expansion. Those are the kinds of issues that this program will help pay for ultimately. And within that, we also used, as I said at the outset, as our basis, an attempt to be as fair as we possibly could be and as equitable as we possibly could be in the broadest sense, and think of the broader public as opposed to each individual interest group.
All right, over to Steve Nesson right there from WNYC and the Gothamist publication. Steve.
Hello.
Hi, Steve.
Thanks for taking questions. Just to follow up, today Mayor Adams did say this is the start of a conversation, but this seems like it's the end of a conversation. So I guess my question is, this plan needs to be approved by the MTA board. It seems like this is a Jenga puzzle, and if you move one piece, everything has to get changed again. So how inflexible, I guess, is this plan, and how much, that's it.
Yeah, it's a very important point. It does all hang together. If you change one piece of it, it affects other things. If you add exemptions, it raises the cost or the fare for everybody. If you charge too much for trucks, for example, coming through the tunnels, it might create diversions, which we wouldn't want to see. So in that sense, it does very much hang together. And again, that was one of the reasons why we've given a lot of thought to this. And I don't want to speak for obviously can't speak for what the mayor intended, but it is a start in the sense that if it's embraced, we will see in a period of time what changes, if any, should be made. But I do think it does hang together, and if you change one piece of it in any significant way, it does affect the others.
Will you be disappointed if they alter it?
We labored hard on this. We think it's a very solid piece, a very solid piece of work. But I've spent most of my career in government and have made proposals many times and made recommendations many times and seen them modified slightly. But I've mostly seen that they are implemented over time in their core, and in hindsight, I'm pretty proud of the recommendations I've made over time.
All right, next up here from Newark, New Jersey, we've got Larry Higgs, NJ.com. Larry, good morning.
Thanks. I have two topics. One is a Jersey-centric topic. The other is general housekeeping. Governor Phil Murphy, in a statement, said that he felt the plan was neither fair or equitable, but saying he supports the concept of congestion pricing. He also said that the state is going to continue with its litigation. My question is, what does that litigation do to your schedule of trying to roll this out either by April 2024 or spring 2024?
I'm a very lapsed lawyer, so I will. One thing I've certainly learned is never comment on litigation. So I won't comment on litigation. I think our recommendations are within both the statute and within the corners of the environmental assessment, and I believe those are the two basic. That's a basic framework that we had to operate within, and I think we have.
All right, you said you had a housekeeping thing. We'll go
Yeah,
real quick.
the other question is about the process. What happens now? Does the Traffic Mobility Review Board vote on this? When do you hope to do that, and when do you expect it to go?
What you have is the report of the Traffic Mobility Review Board, and I will point out that it is a unanimous report in full of the Traffic Mobility Review Board, and even with John Samuelson's resignation, and as he indicated in his resignation letter, he pretty much supports everything in it as well. So that is the report of the Traffic Mobility Review Board, and we stand behind it.
Let's move over to Michelle Caskey right there from Bloomberg News. Michelle.
Hi, thank you. Just wondering, two questions. Based on your recommendations, what do you anticipate in terms of the increase in mass transit? I believe maybe in earlier reports it was an estimate of maybe 1% to 2% increase in ridership. And is that just subways, or is that mass transit overall, or any kind of detail that you can give on that?
I don't know if I can give any detail on it. Juliet, can you?
As I said earlier, we have not conducted the level of traffic analysis, but this tolling structure is within the range of those that were studied in the EA, and those toll structures described in the EA saw, as you just said, a 1.5 to 2 percentage point increase in the number of people using public transit, not just MTA, but public transit overall. Which on MTA facilities represents, depending on the scenario that was described, somewhere between 80,000 and 110,000, more or less, commuters every day. Many of those are on the subway and bus, some are on commuter rail, but in the scheme of a system that carries 6 million plus people a day, it is not a dramatic increase. And of course, ridership levels are still well below pre-pandemic levels, so no concern about overcrowding.
I just want to add to what Juliet said in terms of, less in terms of percentage, but in terms of population. One of the things that will result from this investment in our mass transit system is, first, to some extent, an expansion of our system, but maybe more immediately, certainly more immediately, an increase in accessible stations. And that is, in and of itself, an expansion of who can ride our mass transit system. And not just for a disabled population, but for young families with strollers who have a very difficult time using stations that that are not accessible today. So even within the existing structure, it expands the population that will be able to use mass transit, and that's a benefit that will come sooner rather than later. And to me, that's an expansion of our system, which is very desirable.
All right, moving on here to Evan Simko-Bednarski of the New York Daily News. Evan.
Hi, good morning. I want to talk about revenue for a second. MTA has said in the past that it could take about a year before you've got reliable enough revenue to be able to bond off of. I know that we're talking about an average of $1 billion a year, or else we wouldn't have this sitting in front of us. But I'm wondering if you guys have done projections as to what can we reasonably expect in the first year? Is that going to come on at once, or at what point are we going to see $1 billion reliably coming in to the capital budget?
That I'll have to defer to the MTA. I will say that generating the revenues that the statute requires was something that obviously was central to us, and the modeling that we engaged in said that it is, but the precise answer to your question, I'm not sure I can give beyond that.
I think you've said it just right. This tolling scenario projects being able to meet the $15 billion requirement of the legislation.
All right, moving to Greg Mocker right there from Pix 11, wrapping up the TV stations. Greg.
Thank you, everyone. Could you talk a little bit about how the public comment shaped this process? We heard there were thousands and thousands of emails, and people were invited to submit that. How did you look through some of very personal stories and people who may be impacted by this kind of individually or even as groups, and how did that play into the decisions or discussions that you had?
Well, I mean, you're right. It was there were the number of pages and comments here, and not just the comments, but the environmental assessment itself, and then the comments on the draft environmental assessments, the comments after the environmental assessment was finalized, comments that came in through the MTA portal. Were all looked at, and it was burdensome, and that's burdensome in the sense of it was a lot of it, and that was one of the reasons why our work took a good deal of time, because we did want to see those comments, and I would say, without mentioning specific comments, it did affect our work, and it did, and it did in the aggregate lead to the conclusions and recommendations that we have, but. I wouldn't want to say X comment led to Y recommendation. I think it was a much broader than that, and deeper in many ways.
All right, we got to move on. He's traveled the furthest to get here today. Alfonso Castillo from out east is in the house. Alfonso.
Hello. A couple questions for Julia, just kind of quicker questions, and then for Carl also. What's the $15 base toll for non-Easy Pass, or how does that translate to non-Easy Pass drivers? And how does someone establish that they are transporting someone with a disability and then become exempt?
Okay, so an easy question and a harder question. The final EA specified that the markup for non-New York Easy Pass holders will be 50%, which is in line with what the markup is on MTA facilities today. And your second question was disability. That is a whole operational structure that's being developed by TBTA. There's not as clear legislative direction on that as there is, for example, for emergency vehicles. The final EA describes a system that is based on license plates of vehicles carrying people with disabilities. Can apply to a special plan, and obviously AAR will be one of those vehicles, but also individual vehicle owners with a disability license plate will be able to sign up for this plan.
Thank you. And for Carl, so Newsday in Siena College did a poll of Long Island voters last week, and not surprisingly, they were overwhelmingly opposed to congestion pricing. I think 3/4 of them, I imagine, hearing that they'll be paying $15 or 50% more if they don't have Easy Pass is not going to make them any more happy about this. What do you say to those folks? I know the MTA has suggested that once this is in place and they start to see the results and the difference that it makes, that this is going to become more popular. Do you expect that's the case? Or is it just sort of a wash, and the reality is that these folks will never be happy about this?
You know, I can only say what's happened in other cities that have implemented congestion pricing. Not surprisingly, there's been a wariness, if not some hostility, before the program is launched. Once it is launched, it is accepted and embraced. Certainly that's been particularly true in Stockholm and in London. And I think the results will speak for themselves. In London, for example, the number of vehicles, percentage of reduction in vehicles has gone down significantly, and the people who actually enter the CBD or the zoned area in London has actually increased significantly. So there's clearly been a shift to mass transit. And again, I think we have to recognize for the vast majority, vast majority of people in this region, they use mass transit. And the goal here is to make our, not only reduce congestion, reduce pollution for the region, very important goals to be sure, but the core of this is how do we make mass transit in this region work in as efficient, high quality, reliable way as we possibly can. And that really is what affects the vast majority of people in this region. And that's what the lifeblood of our central business district and the heart of our regional economy. I mean, I think everyone recognizes that without a very effective mass transit system, our economy really does suffer. And that's why the business community supports this.
All right, thanks to Carl Weisbrod. Juliet Michelson, thanks everybody. Thanks for joining us. Thank you
all.